Okay, so Don's kind of giving you this background of what we've seen in terms of the development of these third-party companies. My role at WK is to oversee sort of the editorial guidelines and policies of open access journals within the WK portfolio, which brings me into contact with the sort of the end result of some of these companies and what they're doing. So I'm going to go through some anecdotes of what we've seen and what we'll call the put the fear of God into you. There's the introduction. We'll skip over that. Okay, fake peer review. This is something, oh, now it's not going. There we go. Gosh. Okay. These were headlines that you might have seen in the spring of 2015. There was a whole series of retractions amongst pretty much all the publishers. Hundreds and hundreds of papers were retracted. As a result of that, COPE issued a statement, actually went to that extent. All the publishers got on a phone call, which was held at 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time. And we all sort of compared notes and discussed what we had seen, and this statement was released. And the full statement is in that URL, but I want you to pay special attention to the underlined section, because that's the real difference of what's occurring in the landscape. They're orchestrated by a number of third-party agencies. This is different than what we traditionally would have seen, which I think was more a rogue individual. Right, so a single author who plagiarizes work, or a single author who adds on another author as a gift or something like that, or maybe falsifies data. So what we're seeing now is actually academic misconduct as part of the business model of third-party agencies. So how exactly does this work? And I'm going to go through what these are, and then in the second section I'm going to talk about what we're doing to combat them. But essentially what happens is an author who's developing a manuscript approaches one of these third-party agencies for assistance. You know, perhaps English is not their first language. They've never maybe submitted to a journal before. The third party says, absolutely, you know, this is one of the services we offer. But maybe they say, look, for an additional fee, we can guarantee that you're going to get accepted in one of these journals. So the question is, how do they make that guarantee? Well, the third party takes over the submission process. They act in proxy for that author, and then they're submitting to electronic review systems like Editorial Manager or Manuscript Central that have loopholes that they are exploiting in order to manipulate the review process. So what exactly are these loopholes? Well, many of the tools, and I'm going to refer mostly to Editorial Manager, it's the one I'm most familiar with, but they all have the similar functionality. They're the tools that have been put in the system to make life easier for editors. So for example, the one that was the most exploited was the suggested reviewers option, which exists on all of the major platforms. And this allows an author to suggest potential reviewers on a manuscript. Now that sounds like a really, really terrible idea. But actually there was legitimate reasoning behind this, and I think in practice from journals that I've worked on that have actually used this, the idea is, well, we're not going to use these reviewers for this paper. You know, we're just going to grow our reviewer pool, so if we get a paper on a similar topic, you know, 2 months down the road, we know that these reviewers might be appropriate. And then I think there are some editors who have used this as a fallback option on a paper that's particularly hard to find reviewers for. They say, look, you know, we've already found 2, we need a 3rd, maybe we'll use one of these guys. So there are legitimate uses for this. It's not quite the horrible idea that it first seems to be. So how is it exploited though? And I think that most people would have thought that the exploitation was simply conflict of interest. You know, somebody would suggest a colleague or a neighbor or their neighbor's dog or something like that that would give them some sort of advantage. But that's actually not what's happening here. So they go to the suggest reviewer, the author or the third-party agency does. They're asked to provide first name, last name, institution, email address. That's what's basically required. So they put in a real person's name. This could be a real researcher. So if you vet this, you could find this person at that institution. You know, that this person might be an actual faculty member at that institution. But there's a problem with it, and you can probably all see what it is. It's the email address. right? So the email address given isn't a utexas.edu address, it's a Gmail address. So what happens in practice is that the journal looks at this person, maybe even vets them and says, this is a real person, they're at this institution, great, they look perfect, we'll go ahead and invite them. But the fake email address given doesn't resolve back to the real person, it resolves back to the third-party agency. They're, of course, more than happy to accept the invitation. And the end result of this is that a paper is being reviewed, in part at least, by the third-party agency who submitted the paper. And that's essentially how the fake reviewer scam works. And I'll talk a little bit about how to combat it in the second part. The second thing we're seeing is authorship fraud. I can say, so I've been working as a managing editor in various roles for, let's say, 16 years. And I think in the first 14 years of that, I probably saw maybe two instances where somebody requested an authorship change after an article was accepted. In the last 2 years, I've probably seen about 50. This is just becoming a very common form of fraud, where the author, or perhaps a third-party agency, recognizes that a manuscript is going to get accepted. Maybe it gets accepted pending minor revision, maybe it's in revision, but it's fairly positive reviews. And then they're clearly going around and then selling that authorship. So when Don referred to sitepaper.net, and he says, you can buy authorship onto a paper, this is the circumstance. We had one instance at a WK journal where a paper was submitted. It went into revision. When the first revision came back, every author name had changed. That's pretty brazen, but it's an example of how aggressive these groups are. 5 authors' names have been completely dropped, and a new 5-author group had been added onto the revision. And once again, I'm going to talk a little bit in the next segment, in Part B of this, about what we're doing to combat this. But I think the important thing is just how aggressively these things are being pursued and how shocking some of it is.